The UFC once crowned Ronda Rousey as the baddest woman on the planet, a fighter who seemed untouchable. Hollywood turned her into an action hero, and WWE made her a spectacle. But behind the bright lights and the hype lies a truth the UFC never wanted you to see. Ronda's fall wasn't just about devastating knockouts, it was about favoritism, mental breakdowns, and a carefully buried story that fans were never supposed to hear. And at the center of it all is Dana White, who, as some claim, did something unholy to keep her legacy under his control. Tonight, we reveal what they don't want you to know. When Ronda Rousey first stepped into the UFC, she wasn't just another fighter. She was the hand-picked weapon Dana White had been waiting for to finally sell women's MMA to the mainstream. Before her, Dana had famously sworn that women would never fight in the UFC. But then came Ronda, an Olympic medalist in judo, and the perfect storm of talent, charisma, and danger. From the start, she was marketed as a once-in-a-lifetime force, an unstoppable destroyer who could rip through any opponent in seconds. And for a while, that myth seemed real. Her early fights didn't last long enough for fans to even catch their breath. The armbar became her signature. Violent, clinical, almost supernatural in its speed. The UFC promoted these wins like magic tricks, cutting highlight reels that showed her opponents writhing in agony before the crowd even knew what had happened. She wasn't just winning, she was annihilating. But what most fans didn't realize was how carefully the UFC was engineering this legend. Every fight was handpicked to play into her strengths, showcasing her judo dominance and making her look like the perfect monster they wanted her to be. Dana White hyped her as the greatest female athlete of all time before she had even defended her belt. The machine was already in motion. Critics argued that fighters like Chris Cyborg were deliberately kept at a distance to protect the illusion of invincibility. Instead, Ronda fought opponents who stylistically had little chance against her grappling wizardry. The UFC wasn't just building a champion, they were crafting a myth, one that made millions in pay-per-view sales and drew mainstream eyes to the sport. Ronda Rousey was on magazine covers, late-night talk shows, and movie sets. She was bigger than MMA. She was a brand. But behind the marketing curtain, cracks were already forming. A myth is powerful, but it's fragile. And once it begins to shatter, there's no putting it back together. The truth the UFC didn't want fans to see was just how much favoritism Ronda Rousey received. From day one, she was protected in ways other fighters could only dream of. Media obligations were different for her. Fighters like Miesha Tate or Joanna Jędrzejczyk were forced to do endless press tours, but Ronda was allowed to stay quiet when she didn't feel like talking. If she stormed out of an interview, UFC spun it as passion. If another fighter did the same, they were fined or scolded. Dana White defended her publicly at every turn, portraying her as untouchable, both in the cage and outside of it. And the money, the paydays, were enormous. While women's fighters before her struggled for scraps, Ronda was banking millions. Some of that was deserved. She was a draw unlike anything the sport had ever seen. But resentment built behind the scenes. Fighters whispered that Ronda got special matchups, easier marketing, and even special treatment in training camps. To them, she was less a fighter and more the UFC's golden goose, a star that had to be protected at all costs. The backlash wasn't just from fighters. Fans started noticing her behavior too. Her refusal to shake Miesha Tate's hand after their fight drew boos from the crowd. She was marketed as the face of sportsmanship, but her actions told a different story. The UFC ignored it, burying the criticism beneath highlight reels and carefully edited promos. To them, controversy wasn't a weakness. It was fuel for the spectacle. But the favoritism also came with a price. It isolated Ronda from the reality of fighting, surrounding her with yes-men and shielding her from criticism that could have helped her grow. Instead of evolving her game, she doubled down on what had worked early on, never adjusting until it was too late. The UFC wanted her myth to remain intact, but every myth eventually collides with reality. For Ronda, that collision was coming faster than anyone in the promotion wanted to admit. Behind the highlight reels and the UFC posters, Ronda Rousey was fighting a battle no one wanted to talk about. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of toughness toughness, a woman who could rip through opponents with an aura of inevitability. But the reality was far darker. After her shocking loss to Holly Holm in November 2015, the myth of invincibility was shattered in brutal fashion. Fans saw the head kick that sent her crashing to the canvas, but they didn't see what happened afterward. A broken woman hiding from the world, nursing more than just physical injuries. In a rare, vulnerable moment, months later, Ronda admitted during an appearance on the Ellen DeGeneres show that she sat in the hospital after the Holm fight and thought about suicide. "I was literally sitting there and thinking about killing myself," she said, holding back tears. It was a shocking confession, but perhaps even more shocking was how quickly the UFC brushed it aside. Dana White made no major public statements about mental health. There were no visible campaigns from the UFC about supporting their star through her darkest hour. Instead, the machine moved forward, pretending the myth could still be salvaged. This silence wasn't accidental. It was image control. The UFC didn't want fans to see Ronda as fragile, because the entire brand they had built around her depended on her being unbreakable. To admit she was suicidal was to admit that their superwoman was, in truth, deeply human. That wasn't the story they wanted to sell. Her depression went deeper than just one loss. Ronda had carried pain her entire life. Her father had committed suicide when she was a child, an event that scarred her forever. Growing up with that trauma left her both hardened and haunted. She built a tough exterior that the UFC leaned on, but the cracks had always been there. Holm's knockout simply split them wide open. The UFC's refusal to acknowledge this truth left Ronda isolated. Other fighters might have been able to talk openly about their struggles, but Ronda couldn't. She was expected to return as if nothing had happened, to play the role of the invincible champion again. What they didn't want you to know was that she wasn't just dealing with a defeat. She was staring into the abyss of her own identity. The UFC buried that truth because it didn't sell pay-per-views. After Ronda's fall from grace, something unusual happened. She disappeared. Fighters who lost were usually forced to face the media, explain their mistakes, and answer tough questions. But Ronda Rousey was treated differently. She vanished from the spotlight, skipping press conferences and refusing interviews. The UFC allowed her to retreat into silence, while the organization quickly shifted focus to other fights, carefully protecting her image. For anyone else, this would have been unacceptable. For Ronda, it was orchestrated. Her relationship with the media had always been strained. Even during her reign, she often bristled at tough questions. One infamous ESPN interview showed her snapping at a host for asking about her Holm loss, shutting down the conversation and walking out. Normally, fighters would face punishment or backlash for this kind of behavior, but UFC smoothed it over. They painted her as passionate, emotional, even misunderstood. Behind the scenes, it was calculated damage control. They couldn't let the public see Ronda breaking down, so they gave her cover. The UFC's control over her narrative went beyond silence. Promotional videos ignored her defeats, focusing instead on her victories, her movie appearances, and her fame outside the Octagon. It was as if the Holm fight and the Nunes disaster never happened. Instead of confronting reality, the UFC buried it under highlight reels. Fans who only watched the promos could almost believe she was still the unstoppable force of old. But there was another layer to the blackout: fear. Ronda herself didn't want to face the media because she couldn't handle the questions. She had built her identity on dominance, and when that illusion collapsed, so did her willingness to talk. The UFC enabling this retreat was a way of preserving what little remained of her myth. If she spoke openly, the cracks would show too clearly. This manipulation wasn't about protecting Ronda. It was about protecting the UFC brand. By shielding her, they shielded themselves from criticism that they had oversold her greatness. Dana White and his team needed the world to believe Ronda's story was still one of dominance, not collapse. That's why the silence lasted so long, and why even today, the UFC rarely acknowledges how brutal her downfall really was. What they didn't want you to know is that the silence wasn't strength, it was erasure. Ronda Rousey didn't just lose fights, she she lost her voice, and the UFC helped bury it. At the height of her UFC dominance, Ronda Rousey wasn't just a fighter anymore, she was a celebrity. Hollywood came calling, and she answered without hesitation. Roles in The Expendables 3, Furious 7, and Entourage turned her from an MMA star into a mainstream attraction. For Dana White and the UFC, this was gold. Every red carpet appearance and every cameo added to her aura, expanding her fame beyond the cage. But behind the glitz, it created a dangerous split. While she was playing a soldier on screen or filming car chases, her opponents were grinding every single day in the gym. The UFC spun her acting career as a sign of greatness, proof that Ronda was bigger than the sport itself. But critics inside MMA circles saw it differently. They argued she was distracted, spread too thin, and losing the edge that had once made her terrifying. Training camps became shorter, less intense. Instead of working on her striking defense, her glaring weakness, Ronda was jetting between film sets and photo shoots. Her coach, Edmond Tarverdian, enabled this, claiming she didn't need to change much. He told her she was already the best. It was a lie she wanted to believe. The favoritism played a role again here. Any other fighter who split focus like this would have been criticized or pressured by UFC brass to recommit. But Ronda was given free rein because she was too valuable to the bottom line. She wasn't just fighting anymore, she was a brand. Dana White bragged about her movie roles, claiming it was proof that she was the UFC's crossover superstar. But behind the celebration, cracks deepened. By 2015, the shift was obvious. Holly Holm had been studying Ronda for years, planning for the moment she'd get her shot. While Ronda was doing press tours, Holm was quietly sharpening her striking. The imbalance became catastrophic when they met. In hindsight, the Hollywood distraction wasn't just a side note, it was a key part of the downfall. Ronda wasn't the same fighter anymore, but the UFC didn't want to admit it. They buried the narrative that she had divided loyalties, presenting her instead as invincible. That silence would make her crash even harder. The night of November 15, 2015, in Melbourne, Australia, was supposed to be another coronation. UFC 193 was built entirely around Ronda Rousey, with commercials, billboards, and endless hype painting her as unstoppable. But what the world witnessed was the complete dismantling of the myth. Holly Holm, calm and methodical, exposed every hole in Ronda's game. Where Ronda rushed forward recklessly, Holm countered with crisp, punishing strikes. By the second round, the aura of invincibility had evaporated. Then came the head kick, a thunderous strike that knocked Ronda unconscious and sent shockwaves across the world. The Queen was dethroned. The UFC scrambled to contain the damage. They called it a fluke, suggesting Ronda would come back stronger. Dana White told reporters she was still the biggest star in the sport, but fans weren't fooled. The Holm fight showed what many had suspected. Ronda's striking defense was non-existent, her coaching was questionable, and her dominance had been inflated by hand-picked matchups. Suddenly, the myth looked more like smoke and mirrors. Yet the real humiliation came with her comeback attempt. After more than a year away, Ronda returned at UFC 207 in December 2016 to fight Amanda Nunes. The UFC marketed it as her big redemption arc, splashing her face on every poster while barely promoting Nunes, the reigning champion. But the fight was no redemption. Nunes battered Ronda from the opening bell, landing shot after shot. In just 48 seconds, the fight was over. Ronda didn't throw a single strike of consequence. The baddest woman on the planet looked helpless, and the UFC's investment collapsed on live television. After that, silence. Dana White didn't push for another fight. The UFC stopped mentioning her name in the same breath as legend. They quietly moved on, shifting focus to Nunes and the next stars. What they didn't want you to know was that Ronda's fall wasn't just a loss, it was a marketing disaster. The UFC had built her up too high, too fast, and when she crashed, they buried her story to protect themselves. Ronda Rousey didn't retire with dignity. She vanished, broken, as if the UFC had erased her the moment she was no longer useful. When Ronda Rousey walked away from the UFC, the silence was deafening. There was no farewell fight, no press conference, no acknowledgement from Dana White that one of his greatest stars had just left the sport forever. Instead, Ronda quietly transitioned into WWE, a move that seemed bizarre for someone once hailed as the most dominant fighter alive. To the UFC, this was an uncomfortable reality. Their baddest woman on the planet had swapped the cage for scripted entertainment, and the way the UFC handled it made their feelings clear. They simply stopped talking about her. In WWE, Ronda thrived in a different way. She became a spectacle, drawing headlines for WrestleMania appearances and championship runs. The fans who once booed her UFC silence now cheered as she played out storylines in the squared circle. But in the fight world, her reputation had changed forever. Instead of being remembered as a pioneer, her exit was seen as an escape. To critics, it looked like she had run from the cage the moment she could no longer dominate. The UFC's reaction reinforced this narrative. Dana White, once her loudest supporter, barely mentioned her name. There were no Hall of Fame inductions, no constant replays of her highlights like they did with other legends. It was as if she had been erased, her years of dominance now a ghost story the UFC didn't want to retell. For the company, her WWE career was an embarrassment, proof that their golden girl had abandoned legitimacy for theater. But beneath that silence was strategy. By not acknowledging Ronda's WWE career, UFC avoided drawing attention to how quickly she disappeared after the Nunes fight. To bring her up meant to remind fans of her humiliating downfall, so they buried her legacy, letting her fade into another world. What they didn't want you to know was that Ronda's pivot to WWE was less about passion for pro wrestling and more about survival. It was the only place she could rebuild her image after the UFC had broken her myth. And by the time she was gone, it was clear she hadn't retired as a champion. She had vanished as a casualty of hype. Long before Ronda Rousey became a household name, her life was defined by pain. Her father, Ron Rousey, committed suicide when she was just 8 years old, leaving her with a wound that never healed. That tragedy became the backdrop for her toughness, the foundation of the fighter who would one day break arms and command cages. But it also left scars that shaped her entire life. The UFC never wanted fans to see this side of her. It was easier to sell her as unbreakable than to reveal she was driven by a pain that never went away. Growing up, Ronda battled obstacles that most would crumble under. She struggled with speech issues as a child, making her feel isolated and different. She channeled her rage into judo, training under her mother, Anne Maria DeMars, a former world champion. Fighting became her outlet, her way to escape the trauma of her father's death and the insecurities that plagued her youth. The UFC leaned on the judo champion narrative, but avoided the darker truth that Ronda's rise came from tragedy as much as talent. Her family pain didn't stop there. Ronda often spoke about how her father's death shaped her worldview. She carried a constant fear of losing people she loved, a fear that followed her into adulthood. After the home loss, when she admitted she considered suicide, she tied it back to her father's memory. The weight of that trauma never left her, even at her most successful moments. But the UFC didn't highlight this. They didn't show the broken child behind the fighter because it clashed with the image of the flawless superstar. They didn't want fans to know that every fight, every win, was tied to a wound she could never fully close. To admit that was to admit their champion was vulnerable, and vulnerability doesn't sell pay-per-view. What makes this even darker is how that pain may have fueled her downfall. Instead of dealing with it, Ronda buried it beneath fame, success, and the UFC spotlight. When the losses came, the trauma resurfaced like a ghost consuming her. The UFC ignored it, pushing her forward until she broke. The truth is, Ronda Rousey wasn't just a fighter undone by head kicks and punches. She was a child forever haunted by her father's death, a woman carrying grief the UFC never wanted you to see. Ronda Rousey's story should have been immortalized in UFC history as the pioneer who shattered barriers for women's MMA. She was the reason Dana White reversed his stance on female fighters, the reason the UFC UFC headlined arenas with women's bouts, and the reason little girls across the world saw combat sports as something they, too, could dominate. For years, she carried the weight of an entire division on her shoulders. And yet, when you look at how the UFC talks about her today, the silence is almost eerie. The company rarely mentions her in the same breath as Amanda Nunes, Georges St-Pierre, or Anderson Silva. It's as though Ronda has been reduced to a forgotten chapter, her once mythical reign buried beneath the rubble of her brutal downfall. Why? Because acknowledging Ronda means confronting the uncomfortable truth. The UFC built her up too high, too fast, and too recklessly. They sold her as invincible, and when she collapsed, the myth collapsed with her. For the UFC, it was easier to erase her than to admit their role in overhyping her. Highlight reels still exist, but they're rarely played. Her records and achievements are there, but they're whispered instead of celebrated. To promote her now would mean to remind fans of Holmes' head kick, of Nunes's 48-second destruction, and of the silence that followed. But Ronda's legacy is more complicated than the UFC wants it to be. Yes, she was a flawed fighter. Her striking never evolved, her coach failed her, and her attitude toward opponents often made her seem arrogant. Yet she was also a trailblazer. Without her, there may have never been a women's bantamweight division in the UFC. Without her, Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko may never have had the stage they did. The UFC knows this, but they don't want fans to remember it. They want her memory buried beneath new stars, her role minimized so the cracks in their history remain hidden. And that's the tragedy. Ronda Rousey should have been celebrated as the woman who changed the fight game forever. Instead, her story has been carefully erased, treated as an embarrassment rather than a revolution. The truth they don't want you to know is that the UFC owes her everything, even as they quietly push her into obscurity. Ronda's legacy wasn't just dominance, it was fragility, sacrifice, and a painful reminder that when the UFC is done with you, they don't build statues, they dig graves.